For dinner, the footman lays the cloth. A tablecloth should be laid without a wrinkle, and this requires 2 persons. He prepares knives, forks and glasses, with 5 or 6 plates for each person, and opposite to each a napkin, neatly folded, within it a piece of bread or small roll, and a knife on the right side of each plate, a fork on the left, and a carving knife and fork at the top and bottom of the table, outside the others, with the rests opposite to them, and a gravy spoon beside the knife. When we think of Victorian London, we might think of chimney sweeps and pickpockets. But one of the most common jobs is not out on the streets or even in the factories, but hidden behind closed doors. Domestic service. Throughout the 19th century, being a domestic servant is the single largest employment for women. And by the time of the census in 1871, it is the largest employment across the whole country. But these days, that work has almost entirely disappeared. The Victorian arrangement, where a servant lives in-house and gets a salary, is very rare today. Much of the work once done by hand is now done by machine or by the supermarket. When people are hired to do domestic work, they rarely live in the family's house on call 24 hours a day. So what was the job like? And how well would you fare as a Victorian servant? Brushing clothes is a very simple but very necessary operation. Fine cloths require to be brushed lightly and with rather a soft brush, except where the mud is to be removed, when a hard one is necessary, being previously beaten lightly to dislodge the dirt. Lay the garment on a table and brush it in the direction of the nap. Having brushed it properly, turn the sleeves back to the collar so that the folds may come at the elbow joints. Next, turn the lapels or sides back over the folded sleeves. Then lay the skirts over level with the collar so that the crease may fall about the centre, and double one half over the other so as the fold comes in the centre of the back. First off, why do so many people work as servants? Well, there's a huge demand. A big townhouse, like these ones near Regent's Park, might have up to 20 servants. A country house will have more, maybe 30 to 40, plus up to 70 when you factor in what are called outdoor servants, gamekeepers, gardeners, grooms and ostlers. Why do these houses need so many servants? Well, it's partly because it is much harder to keep things clean in the Victorian period. Stainless steel hasn't been invented yet, so knives have to be treated after every wash to stop them rusting. Gas lamps and coal fires throw black grime into the air that settles on everything. The roads are often unpaved and covered in horse muck, so shoes need to be constantly cleaned and polished. To run a single bath, someone needs to fetch in water from the pump outside. Then you need to heat it all up and carry it all out again afterwards. Most houses do not have a plumbed-in bathroom yet, so every bedroom needs a servant to bring a separate basin and a jug of water and take it away again multiple times a day. You will also find a huge amount of washing up left over from every meal. You remember that scene in Titanic with like a dozen knives and forks set out per person? That is an accurate portrayal of what dinner parties were like. Imagine having to wash up after that. A typical country house might have 600 pots and pans, soup spoons, gravy boats, port decanters, butter knives. Even a middle-class dinner party might make 400 pieces of washing up. Today, if you had anything like that amount of washing up, you'd bung it in a dishwasher. But in the 19th century, it must all be done by hand. A lot more things are made in-house rather than bought. You can't pop to Tesco, so a big country house is going to have to make its own cleaning fluid, starch, boot polish, soap, candles, vinegar, cosmetics, rat poison, medicine, ink, toothpaste, pickles, shampoo, beer, spirits, bread, butter, jam. In some houses, the vats and storehouses needed to make all this stuff are so big that actually the family only live in a small part of the house. Most of the house is the servants' area. In fact, in middle and upper class households, the family often never sets foot in the servants' quarters and won't be able to find their way round. The lady of the house will be wearing many layers of skirts and chemises and will change clothes several times a day. Morning gowns, walking dresses, tea gowns, evening gowns. All of these need to be cleaned by hand, and often pieces like lace or trim will need to be unpicked, washed separately, and then stitched back on. Then there are jobs that don't need to be done today at all. Fireplaces need blacking. Candles need trimming. The upper classes go everywhere on horseback or in a carriage, so they need people to feed and groom all their horses and muck out their stables. Even a tiny job like buttering bread takes longer in this period because the spreadable stuff hasn't been invented yet. Have you tried spreading block butter? It takes ages. And everything has to be done to the kinds of standards that only occur to those who don't have to do the work. Every mantelpiece has to pass the white glove check. At Manderson in Scotland, the servants have to take apart, polish, and reassemble the great staircase twice a year. And the more servants you have, the more servants you need to clean up after those servants. There's also the fact that it is just cheaper to hire servants in the 19th century than it is today. According to Dickens' Dictionary of London, the annual salary for a maid in 1882 can be anything from £30 a year to just £6, depending on her duties, experience, and benefits. According to the same book, paying a girl to be at your service night and day for a whole year is about the same as it costs to rent a P.O. box, or 3 annual memberships to Wimbledon Tennis Club, or 20 batteries for medical purposes. You see, this is why you should always be suspicious of anyone telling you that they can convert any historical sum into today's money, because in 1882, a year's service is worth the same as 20 batteries. 19th century people are also more willing to work in service than 20th century people. Nowadays, you might think of a servant as being a bit demeaning, but that's not how it's seen in the 19th century. Being a servant is a respectable job, certainly more respectable than being a docker or a coster girl. You live in a house posher than you can afford, you have a steady income, and the job leaves you with very little chance to get up to mischief. The higher up the social scale your mistress is, the higher up you are, and there can be some career progression as you work your way up to more responsibility or a more high-status mistress, or both. But chances are you won't start in a well-paid, high-status position. Chances are you'll be at the bottom of... We need hardly dwell on the boot cleaning process. 3 good brushes and good blacking must be provided. One of the brushes hard to brush off the mud, the other soft to lay on the blacking, the third of a medium hardness for polishing, and each should be kept for its particular use. The blacking should be kept corked up, except when in use, and applied to the brush with a sponge tied to a stick, which when put away rests in a notch cut in the cork. Much delicacy of treatment is required in cleaning ladies' boots, so as to make the leather look well polished, and the upper part retain a fresh appearance, with the lining free from hand marks, which are very offensive to a lady of refined tastes. Obviously, the wealthier an employer is, and the bigger their house, the more servants they have. So a junior clerk or a small grocer, for example, might not be able to afford any servants at all, but they might just be able to hire a charwoman, a sort of freelance servant, very low down in the pecking order indeed, to come in once a week to help with laundry. Laundry is a huge job throughout most of history, with no washing machines or even modern detergents. In fact, it's so big that on laundry day, even a country house full of servants might hire in extra help. You have to fetch in all the water and heat it all up. You can't buy washing powder until the 1880s, so before then, you have to make all the detergent from scratch. There's no Persil. Any garment that's got lace or ribbons or silk on it is too delicate to wash, so you have to unstitch the trimming and sew it back on again afterwards. You have to do all the scrubbing and rinsing by hand. And clothes are so much more expensive in the 19th century that clothing theft is a huge problem. So someone has to sit and literally watch them while they dry. Collars and cuffs have to be starched, and dyes aren't as colour fast as they are today, so you have to do a separate batch for all the colours. So some houses, especially what we now think of as stately homes, will have dozens of servants of many different ranks, degrees and specialities. If you're going to make it in this profession, you will need to understand the hierarchy. Someone who can only afford one servant will have a maid of all work, a lone female servant who does everything, sometimes as young as 13 or 14. A maid of all work is a very lowly servant indeed. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management says, "The maid of all work is perhaps the only one of her class deserving of commiseration. Her life is a solitary one, and in some places her work is never done." Mrs. Beeton then goes on to list the duties of a maid of all work: to open the window shutters, light the kitchen fire, and sweep the ashes out of the oven and relight it for breakfast, sweep the kitchen floor and tidy up and put the kettle on, then go into the family breakfast room and open the curtains and light the fire in there and set the table, then sweep the passage and the front steps and scrub the steps clean, dust and polish the door knocker and sweep the mat, take a jug of warm water up to each bedroom, then clean the parlour, roll up the rug by the fire and shake it outside, sweep the fireplace, polish the grate and light the fire, polish the fire irons and the fender and dust the fender, sweep the carpet and clean the hearth, put the rug back, dust the furniture, shake out the curtains and tie them back, lay the tablecloth for breakfast, set out teacups and coffee cups, as well as a teapot, coffee pot, milk jug, slop basin, teaspoons, knives, plates, egg cups, egg spoons, a salt cellar and a butter knife, fill the coal scuttle. And that's just what she has to do before breakfast. After that, a mistress with a little more means will hire a second maid. Now, the first is no longer a maid of all work. She has graduated up to a housemaid. And it will be a mistress. The job of figuring out what servants are needed and finding good candidates is the wife's job. Many books, such as Mrs. Beeton's, are published to teach upwardly mobile mistresses how to act like they've always had servants, how to instruct the servants to do their jobs, and how to belong in this newly expanding middle class. As with the commander of an army or the leader of any enterprise, so it is with the mistress of a house. Her spirit will be seen through the whole establishment, and just in proportion as she performs her duties intelligently and thoroughly, so will her domestics follow in her path. If the mistress has a baby, the second maid will be a nursemaid. A nursemaid is a kind of turbocharged babysitter. Once a child has been weaned, a nursemaid will be found to wash it, dress it, feed it, and take it for walks. She must mend the baby's clothes, teach it to walk, and look after it when it gets ill. She must also look after the nursery, the child's playroom, lighting the fire, making the bed, bringing up water to wash with, dusting and scrubbing the floors. A big house with several small children might have several nursemaids. If there's only one other housemaid, then she'll probably be doing a lot of the work in the rest of the house as well. It's little wonder that one nursemaid, Mrs. Layton, said that she was worked so hard that she often fell asleep on the stairs on her way to bed. A mistress who can afford a third servant will generally go for a cook. The trio of housemaid, cook and nursemaid is a core minimum for running a respectable family house, and something that any family rising out of the working class aspires to. A cook's job is pretty self-explanatory. Unless you're working in the house of a very high-ranking family, like a duke or a prince, the cook will generally be a woman. The cook is the head of the kitchen. But bear in mind that she will be cooking a huge amount of food that we would simply buy from the supermarket today. Bread, sauces, jams, pastries, gravy, and preserves of all kinds. The oven isn't electric, but lit with an actual fire, which has to be cleaned in the morning and then left burning all day. You also have to serve a dinner that might consist of many, many more courses and dishes than we would have today. And everything has to arrive at the table at the same time and hot. A cook in a wealthy household might have several housemaids, kitchen maids, and scullery maids working under her, keeping the floors scrubbed and the pans clean. A scullery is a back room off the main kitchen where the washing up is done and food waste is slopped out. After that, a family might get their first manservant, and then perhaps a lady's maid or a kitchen maid, or someone to look after their new coach, or a butler. After this, any more servants are going to have increasingly specialised jobs, like valets, pastry chefs, and footmen. But what do all these different servants do? Let's take a look at a few more common types you might run into. A parlourmaid is an ordinary housemaid whose job also includes answering the door and announcing visitors. This is usually a man's job, so only families who can't afford a manservant to do it will employ a woman. Because she's representing the house to guests, the mistress will generally choose the prettiest housemaid for this job. The nearest male equivalent of a maid is a footman. Once a family has a small pool of female servants, they might start looking for a footman. Your job as a footman will include dirty jobs like cleaning knives, shoes, and silver, and bringing in coal. And if your master does not have a valet, then you'll do some of that work too. But after breakfast, you get dressed up. Footmen will often have a livery to wear, a uniform, often based on much older 18th century styles. Your job is to look good to people outside the house. You might be running errands in town, or answering the door, or riding on the back of the family's carriage, opening and shutting the door for them, and generally looking very impressive and imposing. In fact, for this reason, families like to hire footmen in matched pairs, 2 men that are the same height and that look good in the uniform. But your main job as a footman will be as a waiter, serving especially at dinner, but also breakfast and lunch if necessary. A lady's maid is a personal servant to the lady of the house. Your duties will include brushing her clothes, bonnet and shoes, laying out her clothes for the day, and setting up her dressing room. You will need to be an excellent hairdresser, as you'll be fixing her elaborate Victorian hairstyles, and you'll be the one dealing with her milliner, dressmaker and perfumer. But this job isn't all floating around with glamorous clothes. You might also be emptying out her chamber pot and cleaning her combs. To be hired as a lady's maid, it is an advantage to be young, pretty, and ideally French. A valet is like a lady's maid, but for the man of the house. You'll be tying his ties, brushing dirt off his coats, warming his underwear in front of the fire, and if he calls for it, shaving him. When he's ready to leave the house, you'll be there, holding out his cane, hat and gloves, and you'll open the door for him. At dinner, you'll be his personal waiter. You'll be spending a lot of time up close and personal with the most powerful person in the house. And that makes you a little bit more powerful too. In fact, the relationship between a master and his valet is so close that these days it often reads as queer. Think Jeeves and Wooster or Sam and Frodo. A governess is a tutor for the family's children. You'll teach them reading and writing and possibly other things as well, like French or sewing. Because you need to be well educated yourself, you probably won't get a job as a governess unless you are from the same class as the family. The only reason a woman of gentle breeding would take a salaried job in this period is because they are absolutely desperate, perhaps orphaned or abandoned. This means governesses hold a weird liminal space in the household. You're expected to have the manners and education of a lady, even as you hold the rank of a servant. The very best families will have at least one horse and carriage, and that requires a whole raft of servants of its own. A coachman to drive the coach and keep it clean, a groom to feed, groom and brush and exercise the horses, and a stable boy to muck out the stables, sweep and wash the floor. Any family that owns land will have a gamekeeper to breed pheasants and pigeons for shooting, as well as to keep poachers off your land. At the top of the servant hierarchy are the butler and the housekeeper. They are the heads of the male and female servants, respectively. It will be the housekeeper's job to keep the household accounts for things like groceries and candles, to supervise the servants, and to deal with tradesmen, like the coal heaver and the baker. The butler is the head of the male servants, and therefore only found in larger houses that actually have male servants. You will be serving meals, assisted by your team of footmen, announcing dinner and serving the wine during the meal. In fact, alcohol is the main purview of the butler. The word butler is related to the word bottle. You'll be keeping the drinks cabinet stocked, advising on wine, keeping the cellar catalogued, making sure everything's aging properly, and even brewing malt liquors. You will have to be a very trustworthy person indeed to gain the keys to your master's wine cellar. So you'll often also be keeping the family's silver plate and fine china in your room. Now, there are some perks to being a servant. You can make money from what the family throw away, and you might actually negotiate this as part of your job offer. A lady's maid might expect to get her mistress's cast-off clothes, and as a cook you'll be able to sell the dripping and grease left over in the household, to be used as the poor man's "I can't believe it's not butter." You can also expect tips from any house guests. If you're a housemaid cleaning a guest's bedroom, you can expect about 5 shillings for 3 to 4 days, or 10 shillings for a week. A coachman who drives guests to and from the railway station might expect half a crown. A groom who prepares a guest's horse for riding might expect 5 to 10 shillings. A gamekeeper who takes guests out shooting might expect 10 shillings a day. But for those perks, there are strict rules for your behaviour. The furniture must be carefully gone over in every corner with a soft cloth, that it may be left perfectly free from dust, or where that is beyond reach, with a brush made of long feathers or a goose's wing. As modern furniture is now nearly always French polished, it should often be rubbed with an old silk rubber, or a fine cloth or duster to keep it free from smears. 3 or 4 times a year, polish may be applied with very great success, as any of them make French polished furniture look very well. One precaution must be taken not to put too much of the polish on at one time, and to rub, not smear, it over the articles. Mix the ingredients together, adding the water when cold, shake the mixture frequently in the bottle, and do not use it for 48 hours after it is made. It should be applied with a piece of flannel, the furniture polished with a duster, and then with an old silk rubber. A great deal of importance is attached to names. If you call the scullery maid Miss Jenkins, you'll get some funny looks. And if you call the housekeeper Flossie, expect to lose your position altogether. The servants at the top of the pecking order, the butler and the housekeeper, you should call by their last names. But if you're a lower ranking servant, everyone will probably call you by your first name. You must not speak to the family unless you are spoken to, even to say good morning. But if you are called to address the master and mistress of the house, you should call them Sir and Madam. If you're addressing the children, you should call them Miss, Master, or Sir. Sometimes the family might decide that they won't call you by your own name at all, either because they can't be bothered to learn your name, or because you share the same first name as one of the children of the house. In that case, they'll choose a new name for you. This is most likely to happen to a servant who's very visible, but very low ranking, like a footman. Perhaps the first footman in the house is always called John, and the second one is always Charles, no matter what your real name is. If your master or mistress is in the room, You must not sit down. In 1873, it's calculated that a housemaid's day generally lasts from 6 in the morning to 10 at night, with 4 hours break for meals, giving 12 hours work every day, longer than is legally allowed in a factory job, for example. In addition, servants have to work at weekends, while factory workers get a half day on Saturday and a full day off on Sunday. So you won't have much free time, but what should you do with the free time you have? Well, you mustn't make any noise, which might disturb the family upstairs, so no music, dancing, or even loud laughter. You can't practice the piano or invite friends over. Do not read, except the Bible and your prayer book. Maids who read novels are thought of as silly and airheaded and spending money on useless, frivolous things. Maids who read non-fiction must be trying to improve themselves, and that won't do at all. No one wants a maid with ideas above her station. The more ignorant the woman, the more likely the machine. And a docile machine, a transferable slave, that is their ideal of a good servant. The best thing to do is probably to work on your sewing. Making quilts and samplers is very popular. The V&A holds this one in their collection made by a servant called Elizabeth Parker around 1830. It's very unusual in that she's not making it to show off her repertoire of decorative stitches, but as a diary entry. She tells us that she is not allowed to write, so instead she is pouring her heart out, one red stitch at a time, onto this canvas. She talks about how she left home at 13 to become a nursemaid, how at one family she was thrown down the stairs. They treated me with cruelty too horrible to mention. For trying to avoid the wicked design of my master, I was thrown down stairs. But I very soon left them and came to my friends. But, being young and foolish, I never told my friends what had happened to me, they thinking I had a good place and good usage because I never told them to the contrary. They blamed my temper. Although the writing chillingly cuts off mid-sentence, later historians have tracked Parker down and found that she survived domestic service and became a teacher, living into her 70s. There are 3 ways that servants are hired in the 19th century: through agencies, called registry offices, through adverts in the newspaper, and through word of mouth. A mistress will prefer to go by word of mouth, when possible. She'll talk to her friends and acquaintances and ask if they can recommend anyone. However you find your situation, one thing you must have is a good reference from your previous mistress, called a character. You can get a written one, but generally any new mistress will prefer to speak to your previous one face to face. Without a good reference, it will be almost impossible to find a new job. This means that if an employer treats you badly, if they scream at you, insult you, hit you, or even sexually assault you, there's very little you can do about it. They always have the threat of taking away your character, leaving it impossible for you to get another job. So let's go over some things that you should avoid at all costs. The threat of losing your character is always hanging over you, and there are some cardinal sins. Be wary of wearing clothes that make you look too good. For most of the 19th century, servants generally don't have uniforms. Your mistress might give you some fabric to make your own dress with. Wow, more work to do. Thanks. But be wary of making something with too many pin tucks and ruffles. If you're a maid, your mistress might get jealous of how good you look, especially if you're younger and prettier than her, and worry about leaving her husband alone with you. If you're a footman or a butler who dresses too well, your mistress might worry that her friends won't know you're a servant. How embarrassing to turn to someone at a party and strike up a conversation, only to find out they're staff. No hostess wants to put her guests in that situation. Towards the end of the period, employers start making their servants wear uniforms for this reason. Beware of the tricks employers might pull. Imagine you're sweeping the floor in the parlour one day. You move the rug out of the way and look, there's a 6pence. Well, you can't put it on the side, that's just making more mess. Put it in your apron pocket for now and you'll think about it later. But then the mistress of the house comes in. Aha! You stole my 6pence. and you're fired. Maybe you should have left it where it was? Then she'd fire you for not cleaning under the rug properly. Do not get sick or disabled. Your employer will not want to carry on paying you if you can't work. Your family should be in the peak of health too. Your employer will also not be thrilled about your leaving to visit a dying parent. Do not let your feelings show. Your employer does not want to think about how hard your work is, or how tired you are, or how lonely. Even if the mistress screams in your face, you're not allowed to argue or answer back. Eliza Linton said what was particularly galling is that even if you're totally in the right, you'll never get an apology. No one acknowledges she has been unjust or apologises to the maid she has wronged. Accused wrongfully, she must not justify herself. I allow no answers, says the mistress, severely. On leisure days, the housemaid should be able to do some needlework for her mistress, such as turning and mending sheets and darning the house linen, or assist her in anything she may think fit to give her to do. For this reason, it is almost essential that a housemaid in a small family should be an expert needlewoman, as if she be a good manager and an active girl, she will have time on her hands to get through plenty of work. So this seems like a pretty terrible job. Low pay, poor conditions, no security. But that describes a lot of working class jobs in the 19th century. So why do people suddenly start leaving service at the end of the period? Well, conditions in other industries start improving, while domestic service still offers the same poor conditions it had before. One major factor is that the job is very antisocial. Other girls in your social class might be going into factory work. And in a factory, at least you could talk to your friends while on break, and you can meet men. In domestic service, you won't be permitted or have the time to go and meet friends for a drink in the evening, and you will especially not be allowed gentlemen callers. Actually, one book from the 19th century, written for mistresses to give to their maids of all work, tries to spin this like it's a good thing. The situation of a maid of all work in a tradesman's family is often a very respectable one, and in some respect preferable to service in high families, or in houses where several servants are kept, because if you should like to lay by a part of your wages, which I'll remind you might be a whole £6 a year, in the savings bank, there are no fellow servants to join with for tea and many other expensive articles, nor have you the tempers, and sometimes the hindrances, of fellow servants to put up with, but have only your employers to please. Isn't it nice and relaxing to only have your boss to talk to? I'm glad I don't have any friends who might get in the way of work. Also, towards the end of the period, uniforms become more common, ruling out one of the few ways that women can express themselves, through their dress. Even an ordinary housemaid will probably know enough sewing to be able to show off some fancy techniques on her dress, whether it's pleating or soutache or just really neat needlework. And there aren't many other venues of expression open to servants. You can't redecorate your room or learn the piano or write the next best-selling novel. But if you're wearing a uniform, that last avenue of creativity has been closed off to you. I know from jobs where I've had to wear a uniform that after about a year I utterly detest the thing. And those have been 9-to-5 jobs where I can take it off at the weekend. I can't imagine having to wear one every day from waking till sleeping. And partly, domestic service becomes less popular because, unlike with other professions, such as factory work, by the end of the 19th century, there haven't been any laws passed mandating better working conditions for servants, meaning they worked longer hours than other professions. A factory worker got Saturday afternoon and Sunday off, whereas a servant might just get Sunday afternoon off when all the shops are shut anyway. Towards the end of the century, working class people in many different lines of work are going on strike for better conditions, such as the girls at the Bryant and May factory and dock workers in the 1880s. These strikes are huge, with daily marches of thousands of workers. And they work across the country. Workers are securing better pay or better conditions or both. But if you're in domestic service, going on strike to improve your conditions is impossible. How can you organise with other workers when you can't leave the house to talk to each other? And this shows in the conditions of the job. Beyond food, lodging and wages, servants generally have no rights. Holidays are rare and irregular. The only day off is Sunday when the shops are shut, or at night when it's dark. Even if your parents are dying, you will be told you are extremely selfish for asking for a day off on the day of your mistress's big dinner party. If a servant is not sleeping, he is working, and his sleep, mealtime and break time may be disturbed at any moment. Eliza Linton says, "A servant's work is never done potentially, if even actually. She's liable to be rung up at all hours. Her very meals are not secure from interruption. She has no time that is absolutely her own, and even her sleep is not sacred." If a member of the family falls sick, servants are expected to do their ordinary work, plus care for the patient. To refuse would be seen as discompassionate, and they'd be fired. But if the servant falls sick, they're fired. Nurses are fired as soon as the child leaves the nursery, even if they've formed an attachment to the child. Servants live underground or in the attic, damp, badly insulated spaces. They're not allowed to light fires in their bedrooms. They don't eat as well as the family. Some houses insist that the servants go to the same church as they do. There is never any possibility of improving one's lot above servitude. There's no career path to becoming a lady, for example. At any time, the master of the house might get into financial difficulties and disappear abroad, leaving you not only without a job, but without a character to get a new job. But what might surprise you is that domestic service didn't die with the Victorians. It didn't go down with the Titanic, and it wasn't killed off by the First World War. Domestic service carries on through the 20th century. Agatha Christie's works often feature maids and butlers well into the 1940s. But you do see a feeling that servants are less willing to live in. People feel like the end is in sight. In 1927, the writer J.B. Priestley declares domestic servants as obsolete as the horse. After the Second World War, the live-in servant declines in favour of a host of unseen workers with new names. No longer maids, but cleaners. No longer nursemaids, but nannies. Not governesses, but au pairs. Not a coachman, but a driver. A lot of houses don't get washing machines or electric lights until pretty late into the century, but eventually labour-saving devices do start to arrive. By 1948, 86% of homes in this country have electricity. Furniture starts getting more stripped back and easier to clean. Products like detergent, jam and boot polish no longer have to be made in-house.
In 1960, we get fairy liquid.
The idea that you should at least pretend you have a servant hangs around for ages. The Times is still giving recipes for servantless dishes, food you can cook on your own, and food with no servant meat in it, as late as 1970. But a household can be run by fewer people. Although live-in servants are now much rarer, they're not totally gone, and they've often been replaced with household staff who have to rent their own place and commute to work instead. Much of the work is done by expats and foreign nationals rather than locals. But some things do not change. The employer wants to get as much for their money as possible. It is still very hard to unionise. Pay is still low and hours are still long. A servant's work is still never done.
Hi, Jenny here. Thank you so much for watching. I really enjoyed putting this one together. On the screen at the moment you can see the names of my lovely patrons who keep this show running. If you would like to join them, there's a link in the description. If you want to meet up IRL, I actually have a couple of real-life tours that I'm doing at the moment. I have one about secrets hidden in Covent Garden. I have one that's a brief history of London, crammed into 2 hours. I have one about suffragettes, and I have a kind of grisly ghost one called Gruesome Tales for Grown-Ups. If any of those sound appealing to you, there are links to buy tickets in the description.